Welcome, everyone. This is Josh Baker with DICOM Systems, and thank you for joining us for this latest installment in our 2018 webinar series, De-Identification for AI Consumption. Today's webinar will be recorded for on-demand viewing at a later date. You're welcome to join the conversation. We encourage you to actually go ahead and submit any questions. Those will be submitted privately. You can use the webinar control panel to send those in to us. And towards the end of the presentation, we'll go ahead and address as many of those as we can get in at the end there as time allows. As I mentioned, I'm Josh Baker, Technical Project Manager, and also joining us today is Florent St. Clair. He's our Executive Vice President. Hello, Florent. Good day to you.
Yes, hello, everybody.
And just a little bit about us, if you're not familiar with DICOM Systems. We've been providing some healthcare imaging solutions for the past 10 years or so. Standards-based, as our name says, DICOM in it. And we like to use plumbing to have two different systems talking to each other. Over the last several years, we've kind of expanded our offerings. We have, for example, some cloud-based solutions, a vendor-neutral archive, and because of the diverse set of customers that we have, we have a lot of exposure to the marketplace, and some of our customers recently in the last couple of years have had an increase in their questioning about how we can help them enable their existing data to be used for AI algorithms. So today's webinar is really talking about that type of a solution where you go ahead and take your existing data and use it in a way that's compliant with HIPAA. We have sort of a framework, AI on-ramp framework, where it's composed of a number of steps. And so the primary focus is de-identification. And that's a way that you can take a large volume of clinical imaging studies and clean them up so that they're very useful to the AI algorithm that's going to consume them. And then also, we're going to go ahead and show you an actual use case of this in action, and you can see how that could relate to maybe your own individual AI integrations that you're planning for the future. And then I'll go ahead and spend some time, kind of give you a de-identification 101, some of the basics regarding how you can achieve this high yield with quality output, and at the same time adhere to the HIPAA privacy safe harbor requirements.
So Josh, can you hear me?
Yes.
So if I may, I wanted to provide a little bit of a background and framing of the conversation before we go into too much detail. So last week, some of us had the opportunity to participate and discuss the topic of artificial intelligence in the context of the CMIMI conference, in San Francisco. And we were fortunate to be in the same room with a number of luminaries, data scientists, physicians, computer scientists, a wide variety of individuals who are all amazing professionals in their own fields. And in those conversations, we approached a lot of different topics. One of the things that became really apparent to us is that the field is currently in its infancy. A lot of the use cases that were presented in that conference are super exciting. We had some very lively debates about how the industry is going to monetize AI or not monetize AI, whether there's too much bias in the training of algorithms, whether language should play a role in how those algorithms are designed. We learned a lot of new terms like what's a convolutional neural network. I used to think CNN meant cable news network, but not in our industry. We need to learn what a convolutional neural network is, and in a hurry, right? If we're going to play an active role in artificial intelligence development, there's a whole new world of new vocabulary, scientific, whether it's data science or healthcare, that software developers were helping to develop. need to know. And so there's a lot of learning happening in a hurry. And so I don't want anyone in this audience to feel like artificial intelligence is that far ahead yet. It's absolutely amazing the kind of progress that is being made. But in many ways, we're just at the very, very beginning. And so you should feel confident that you haven't really missed the boat yet. So why is DICOM Systems playing a role in this new world of artificial intelligence? We do not develop artificial intelligence algorithms ourselves, but we are the plumbers. We are the plumbers that are bringing the water to this gigantic data lake that is needed because training an algorithm, especially in medical imaging, just to teach one tiny thing to an algorithm in medical imaging requires 100,000 minimum samples of such images. And so if you can imagine, the thousands and thousands of new use cases that are being thought up by scientists and students and physicians around the world, that there's this enormous demand for data and clean data, the kind of data that is not going to introduce any kind of HIPAA vulnerabilities. And so where we get involved is very simply in ensuring that the data become available without disrupting the patient operations, right? If you can imagine, our first project with HSS in New York was to extract up to 5.3 million exams from their sector packs. Well, how do you do that without disrupting patient operations, right? Some radiologists would probably object if you were doing a DICOM query retrieve of every single one of those exams in order to de-identify it. And so we developed a methodology that allowed us to do that very rapidly without disrupting their patient operations. And then we did our job and we shared the images over a cloud infrastructure with a researcher. And the researcher eventually brought that project to conclusion, which was ultimately the earning of a 510K for some of those algorithms. And so we've now acquired the full circle of experience of what it takes to feed an algorithm and make sure that the data are not in any way introducing vulnerabilities at the HIPAA level. And so I want to give the floor back to Josh, who is going to run us into more of the detail of how we do de-identification. And again, if you have questions, please send them to us electronically and we'll make sure that we answer them in an orderly fashion at the end of our webinar. Go ahead, Josh.
Well, thank you, Florent. So we can see in this recent Gartner CIO survey that earlier this year that nearly half of CIOs are planning to deploy artificial intelligence. So a lot of enterprises are at least exploring, taking those first steps to that journey of AI. So we're excited to be part of that. With those thousands and thousands of algorithms, they're all going to need data. Some are going to be successful, others will fall by the wayside, but regardless, they all need a lot of data to continue to learn and improve and become effective. Some types of applications that we're seeing that kind of have high visibility are, relating to identifying patient or data patterns, I should say. So this could be, for example, disease patterns that are useful to public health officials, or any type of conditions that come up which either increase or decrease readmission rates for a certain patient population. So those are really helpful. Obviously, they're really practical. Additionally, there are algorithms we see that combine multiple diagnostic interpretation styles. So we all know, for example, if you have two radiologists who are reading the exact same study, they might produce very different diagnostic reports, but both are valid. Each might contain beneficial nuances. And we'll see something kind of interesting related to that a little bit later in our discussion from that CMIMI SIM conference that we attended recently. And then lastly, a machine can outperform the human eye when analyzing an image study. So it has more resources to examine each pixel and perform a comparison against all previous data it's analyzed in the past. So That's a nice tool to assist the radiology in their interpretations. And so I guess we were just talking about that, combining of different interpretations of a study. This is similar to that. And so, Florent, I guess as you went and saw this at this CIMC conference on machine intelligence and medical imaging, and this I believe is called a RAD swarm.
Yeah, the radiology swarm is a fascinating look at how we train algorithms. So this is just one methodology, right? So in this case, those little horseshoe-shaped objects on the left side each represent a virtual radiologist that could be joining us from anywhere around the world. In this case, you had 7 of them collaborating on this particular X-ray to see where they would land on a diagnosis of pneumonia. And so you can see in this model that there's essentially a crowdsourcing of the diagnosis going on, which is a really interesting way to solve one of the key problems in the training of algorithms, which is the dilemma that we have. We can't really do unsupervised deep learning on medical images. The algorithms really need to be given some very well-educated idea about what they're looking at. And so if you're giving multiple radiologists an opportunity to collaborate on the training of those algorithms, now you're not putting it in the lap of one radiologist who would now have, potentially a biased opinion of whether or not this patient has pneumonia. And so in this case, you can see that the opinions of these 7 radiologists are making the diagnosis gravitate towards anywhere between 80% and 100% certainty that this patient has pneumonia. So this is a static image, so it's not even as compelling when you look at it now as when it is animated. When Stanford presented this at the CMIMI conference in San Francisco last week, this was an animated model, and it showed the progression of the diagnosis from beginning to end, and it was just absolutely fascinating how it works. And so this is one of the ways that the industry is attempting to solve this issue of, how do you feed supervised data, meaning annotated, data that you're not leaving the neural network to figure out on its own. And so this is a very interesting way to solve that issue. Go ahead, Josh.
Thanks for that, sharing that with us. So we mentioned earlier our first foray into de-identification was with a hospital for special surgery out of New York. And Laura, why don't you share with us that, being approached initially for this project and kind of outline what the request was from, as we were learning about, what was the request as far as de-identifying this data and the usage, the intent of the usage of that de-identified data?
Absolutely. So initially, we were actually approached not by the hospital, but by the research partner who needed the data out of the sector packs at HSS. And so we were introduced by HSS by the researchers themselves. We're not at liberty to disclose who they are, but the initial project we were given was a set of 2 million exams, which ended up ballooning to 5.3 million exams. But the initial project was they had identified 2 million exams that corresponded to the kind of data they were looking for to teach an algorithm how to look for a specific disease pattern. And so they gave us a set of accession numbers, and we extracted those accession numbers from the sector packs. We de-identified the data, and then before we actually went to production, HSS actually had us go through a third-party auditor to validate that we were not introducing any kind of vulnerability in the process. And so they scrutinized our software, they scrutinized our processes, our scripts, everything that went, all the thinking that went into the de-identification of those images, up to and including the, verifying the inability to reverse engineer the way that the data were de-identified, right? This was one of the very important criteria, a distinction between kind of an anonymization project and a de-identification project in our mind, which is, do you intend to be able to re-identify any of those data, or do you really want all of those fields to be de-identified permanently in an irreversible manner, which was the case. And so we established this framework. It was audited by a third party, validated. We performed all of this over a period of several months. It took a little bit of time really to set up the system and verify that it was not introducing vulnerabilities. And then once it got onto its rails, the train just, went to its destination pretty rapidly after that. We can go into more detail into the process in this presentation. I think there's a further slide.
Yeah, so this was a really exciting project for us, and the outcome was great. In the end, there was a data lake created of 5.3 million de-identified exams, and so those are ready for ingestion by the research company. And then we were sharing with you earlier that this project was awarded FDA pre-market clearance for AI as a computer-assisted detection and diagnosis software in radiology. So it's really nice to see that kind of come full circle. I kind of walk you through the steps of the entire framework for which we provided to HSS. And so it begins with their PACs, their VNA, their archives, and they went ahead and identified relevant studies that they wanted to de-identify for consumption by the research company. And so they did a bulk export. And again, like Florent mentioned, we assisted in doing that in a way that didn't disrupt their normal operations, their clinical operations. And that was sent to one of our Unifier appliances. And that Unifier appliance, its main function was to perform de-identification of the metadata in the DICOM headers per the spec that was provided by HSS. So there's a very detailed, and we'll kind of see later on how detailed that can get as far as the customization of the de-identification solution. And in addition, there were some burned-in PHI elements for certain modalities, for certain studies. So those had to be pixel anonymized. So we use a Lewis scripting method to perform the header, DICOM header de-identification process, as well as the pixel anonymization. And then once the study is de-identified in that batch, it's sent over to a secondary unifier that's residing in the DMZ that is a quality assurance de-identification component. So this unifier number 2, the secondary appliance, goes through and validates that all of the de-identification rules ran as they should be expected. So unifier 2 is not aware of unifier 1, so it's very independent.
Good job.
Yes.
Pardon the interruption. I think it's worth noting regarding the burned in pixel level data that needs de-identification. This is a very sensitive topic, right? A lot of people approaching a de-identification framework have this notion that, erroneously, that you can apply a very cookie cutter approach to de-identification. And that, de-identification is de-identification, so why should you, worry about it? Well, there's so much subtlety that you do need to think it out at a lot of granular detail. And so when it comes to de-identification of metadata, that's pretty straightforward, right? We can decide with our customer what fields need to be de-identified, in what way, the ability to maintain knowledge of the chronology of creation of the images. Is it an HL7 message that needs to be de-identified? There's a lot of ways that metadata can be handled, but pixel level data is a lot more sensitive because there's a lot more variability. And so in the case of projects where you have either ultrasound devices or images that have been scanned, there's an element of variability that becomes dangerous from a HIPAA perspective. And so it's very important before you start de-identifying that not only do you need to decide which stations to include in the de-identification project, but also which ones to exclude. And so, for example, in this project, we excluded anything that a VIDAR scanner might have contributed to the data record, because that could literally be anything, right? And we're not at the level where we can apply OCR and artificial intelligence and recognize what constitutes PHI in a scanned document versus not. And so if you're going to mass customize and massively de-identify lots of images like we did, 5.3 million exams in that one project, you can't potentially introduce some HIPAA violations by including scans that came from a VIDAR device. And so we excluded them. But in some other cases, it's a lot more predictable, because you're looking at maybe an ultrasound device that is a very well-known entity, and you know for a fact that these multi-frame objects are going to have burned in data in a very specific set of coordinates on the image. And so you can predictably mask or blur those images. And so I wanted to make sure we make that distinction between, pixel level data that should be processed and should not be processed.
Those are excellent points, yes. In addition, as Florent was mentioning, OCR, that is something we are actually have that working in our labs, but have no actual deployments as of yet. But regarding also when you're looking at that burned-in set of data, sometimes you might have additional series, which are, for example, scanned paperwork with handwritten notes, etc. So you also want to make sure that you're omitting those or removing those and identifying those. So there's a lot of intelligence here in this step where we're running this, the de-identification rules. So it's very granular. You'll get an idea later on. I'll show you a lot of different variables, different ways you can approach it. So each one of these projects is very customized to the needs of the institution and the data consumer at the end. So once the secondary QA process is completed, and if for some reason a study fails, it gets sent back to Unifier 1 for reprocessing. If it is clean and it looks good, it passes. Then in the case of HSS, initially we were sending directly to Amazon Web Services, and so that would get sent directly to the cloud repository. And then at a later time, they implemented actual little device, this Amazon Snowball repository, which would then be couriered by FedEx to Amazon Web Services. And so that was just for the business model, made more sense later on. Once it's
that's that Amazon Snowball device is really interesting, almost an antithesis to using cloud, because you're essentially unplugging a server from the cloud, shipping it to the site, filling it up as if it was a direct attached storage, and then shipping it back via FedEx, right? So it's almost counterintuitive to be using this kind of methodology, but it makes a lot of sense when you realize how many millions of exams you would be running through the network, and bringing the network to its knees is not desirable. And so the bulk of the initial set of images was shared with this Amazon Snowball device, which is essentially an unplugged server storage array, shipped to HSS, filled up, connected directly to our server as if it was direct attached, and then shipped back to Amazon. And then, towards the end of the project, most of the transfers were done via the network, but you can see how, the de-identification project could be disruptive to IT operations if you were to utilize so much of the network resources.
It's interesting, like a marrying of two worlds there, but that worked out for them in the long run. So once the data is, this de-identified data is out in the cloud, then it can be made available to outside research partners. And so that's the end goal, and we know it's cleaned, we know it's been normalized, and we were really excited to be able to provide this framework that works really great for them. So I'm just going to go ahead and kind of give you the nuts and bolts regarding our de-identification process, and give you some history if you're new to this, or if you kind of have half information and so on. So all the de-identification efforts really stem from the HIPAA privacy rule that most of you, I'm sure, have gone through HIPAA training. It's just a staple of our business, right? So part of that it has a distinction of protected health information. So that's any type of data that's transmitted electronically that could be used to identify the patient, basically, to simplify that a little bit. So there's a balance there where you have to protect the individual's health information while still providing them some high quality care. In this case, be able to provide some data to AI algorithms. So what we mean by individually identifiable health information, which is our PHI, it's just any part of your history as far as a patient, past, present, or future. This could be physical, mental health. It could be any type of care that was given to you from any care provider, anything to do with payments related to healthcare that was administered to you. And so this, if the information identifies or proves to be a reasonable basis to believe it could be used to identify an individual, it's considered individually identifiable health information. And you'll kind of pick up that that's a little bit of a blanket. You know, they err on the side of being really conservative and trying to make sure they can cover any possibility. So in this rule, there are some provisions that say, in some cases, you can be exempt from the privacy rule. And the exemptions would be if you go ahead and you're able to either, there's a couple methods. One, you have data in an aggregate statistical data format with an expert handling that. Less common. The more common is to have the data stripped of individual identifiers. And once you strip them of these identifiers, then it's considered to be de-identified. So we're going to talk about that secondary method where you strip the identifiers, and that's considered the safe harbor methodology. Now, one thing, and Florent touched on this a little earlier, to keep in mind is there's a difference in what we consider de-identification versus anonymization. So in de-identification, it is possible to re-identify that using a couple different methods, a key and so on. Anonymization, you're blowing it out. There's no way to ever, it's irreversible. You can never get back the original patient identity. So we perform, either or of these. In some cases, a combination of the two, depending on the needs of the data consumer. So as I mentioned, for safe harbor, the main idea is that you're going to go ahead and remove 18 identifiers so that it's impossible or near impossible. As your goal is to make it as near impossible to re-identify the patient. And here's a list of those identifiers. Some are really obvious. You can see these are direct identifiers like a patient's name or their social security number. But number 18 is of note, which is, again, sort of a blanket, which is any other unique identifying number, characteristic, or codes. That could be, you have to be familiar with your own data, make sure that you are making the best effort to make it difficult to go ahead and re-identify. So as far as our de-identification framework, there's several elements. The first is to perform this de-identification so it's compliant with the HIPAA safe harbor methodology we just looked at. That's pretty straightforward. A lot of people look at de-identification and the requirements of safe harbor and go, oh, it's just we can get my my nephew. He plays with computers. He's in college and he can write a script to do this real quick. He could do that, but it's more than that. So yes, you can hit the bare minimum as far as de-identifying the identifiers, but you also want to normalize the data so it's easy to ingest by the data consumer. So this is an important point. So HIPAA doesn't give you any regulation as far as standardization or normalization of data or narrowing the scope of what data is to be de-identified. Additionally, we have the quality assurance process to validate the input. And this is important because there's heavy fines and public scrutiny if you either on purpose or not on purpose. It doesn't matter really. If you somehow have a leak of patient identities, you're going to have a problem, right? So you want that extra QA process to make absolutely sure. And then the last part is, once you de-identify the data, you can go ahead and send that to a number of different places. And Florent, maybe expound on that. Sometimes we have it sent to a cloud, other times it's on-prem. What are some of the different ways people like to export that data?
Well, it varies really. And I think the variability has everything to do with whether or not the health system has been exposed to some kind of a data breach in the past. I think this is inevitable, right? You're going to have some people that are more or less comfortable with sending data to a cloud to then de-identify it, or want to make sure that it is de-identified before it leaves their dock. And so in the case of HSS, not that they've been hit with any security breaches in the past, but they wanted to make sure that anything that hit the servers in AWS were already de-identified. And so that's why we implemented that QA server in their DMZ to ensure that the first server did its job correctly. And so that's one way to do it. And another way would be to essentially deploy over HTTPS 2 instances of our servers, one in the cloud, one on-prem. And so the communication is encrypted. We have a BAA in place with our customers and with the cloud infrastructure. So we're covered from a regulatory perspective, and we're covered from a technical perspective in encrypting data in transit. So again, it's really about preference. And if the security team, the chief information security officer for the hospital, insists on making sure data are de-identified before they leave, then that's what we'll do. This is just a matter of design more than anything else. And so, yeah, that's pretty much all there is to say about that topic.
So when you go ahead and you begin designing your project, your de-identification framework, some things you want to just take into consideration. There's a little bit of planning. There's a lot of planning, I should say. So the first thing, you can approach the direct or indirect identifiers in DICOM metadata a couple of ways. You can just blow it out, you can remove it, or you can replace it with replacement data that is derived from a hash or algorithm that you come up with. But you just want to decide how is that going to be decided. You're going to want to go ahead and make some preparatory charts like this, where you go ahead and indicate the tags and which modalities that you're going to go ahead and de-identify, which tags, which are going to be omitted, etc. So there's a lot of planning. You can get an idea. This is just an example. And just things to think about. Direct identifiers are kind of easy. Patient's name, their email address, social, and those are pretty straightforward. But quasi-identifiers are indirectly identifying variables, or data where you can take a couple different elements, putting them together, kind of figure out who the patient is. So some that are considered are postal codes, religious affiliation, and so on. So you want to keep that in mind as well when you're designing your de-identification framework. Here's an example, DICOM transformations. So you might make a list of your different tags, and you can approach it. You want to make a design, say, okay, here's my tag, and then I want to go ahead and remove these identifiers, or I want to replace them, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of how you would go about designing it. Pixel anonymization, we touched on this a little bit earlier. So as Florent talked about, you might have a modality that burns in PHI or directly into the JPEG. So a DICOM object is basically a JPEG image which has a wrapper, a DICOM header with metadata at the top. And so it's easy to go ahead and work with that header data, but at the pixel level, we have to go ahead and think about how, if it's burned in, like it's part, if you took a picture of PHI, you can't go ahead and edit that using the header, right? So ways you can approach it, here's an example. So you have an image, burned into the image is this PHI. What you have to do is you have to go ahead and find out the modality, the make and model, and some more information about it, and say that make and model, we know the coordinates right here are where PHI resides. So we go ahead and we'll mask that, put like a box around it basically, so that it now is no longer showing. Alternatively, you can also, instead of putting a box, you can add coarse pixelization to mask it, but more commonly is just putting a box over it in our experience. The HIPAA Privacy Rule also provides a guideline for if you want to re-identify a study down the road. So there's some degree of management involved with that. So we'll talk about this re-identification control. There's a few scenarios where you might want to re-identify. For example, if there was a public health, something in the interest of public health, or if a patient in a region where there's a grace period for consent to be used in a clinical study revokes it, and you have to go back and find out how is this used in which models and remove those exports, then you might want to go ahead and de-identify. important to note here, so the key that you use to either to re-identify the data, if there's a key in an algorithm, it cannot be created or derived from any of the individual's identifiable data. So you can't say, well, our hash basically looks at the patient's last name plus their birthday and does this computation to come up with a key. You can't use any of that data. Additionally, you can't keep the passwords anywhere with the database or with the data. It has to be totally separate, and that separate has to be the originating source of the PHI. So the owner of the data keeps the key no matter what. He never leaves possession of the origination. Just a little bit of information here on, how you can run into an issue with, for example, if you have someone reading a study from a clinic where they're familiar with the clinic and the patient population passing through there. This is a real simplistic example, but let's say you can see the color of the hair of the patient, and you're aware of all the patients. Only one of them has red hair. Although it's de-identified, you could derive who the patient was based on the color of the hair. So this is a simplification, but you can get the idea of being careful of derivative conclusions there. When you're de-identifying the DICOM header data, you can go ahead and come up with a series of rules, basically, and you can say, well, in these conditions, do these actions. So if I find this particular value in the DICOM tag, I can either replace it with a created result or created replacement data, or I can remove it. Maybe I'm going to replace it with a static value. So these types of designs, you want to go ahead and fully plan this out ahead of time, write it all down. You, again, remember I was mentioning that it's more important than just hitting those 18 modifiers. You want to go ahead and normalize the data so it's easy to consume. So you might want to do a unified code set, right? So all the different institutions who supply the data to be de-identified are probably using or can be using different code sets. And study descriptions, for example, you could normalize it with the standard code set. Same with capitalization. You want to clean that up, make it a little bit more presentable, easier to query. The laterality abbreviations is a good example. So make this simple for a data consumer to work with.
Hey, Josh.
And, yes.
Sorry to throw you off kilter there, but I think there's an interesting problem that I don't think the industry has solved yet that is worth mentioning in the de-identification project. So we take so much care to de-identify metadata and mask embedded data in some of the images. Yet, if you think about it, if you take a stack of coronal or sagittal images and you put them all together, especially if you have thin slices, and you turn into a 3D image, well, the ultimate identifier, somebody's face, could be recognized, right?
Well, that's interesting.
So I'm mentioning this not because we have an answer to this, but because this is a problem that's been posed to us along the project. And so, the thin slices is an example of data that really should be, at this point, until we figure out an answer to this problem, that should be excluded from the data sets, until we figure it out. But I just don't want the audience to get the idea that this is such an exact science yet. We're still, everybody's learning on the job how to do this correctly without in any way harming the patient's record. So I thought it was worth mentioning at this point.
Yeah, definitely it is an evolving, and we're getting better at it, but there's always scenarios nobody thought of, as with many technologies and regulations and such. So additionally, we want to go ahead and make sure, because we're dealing with a lot of data, right? So let's be efficient with, if we're going to be pushing all that data, let's make sure it's relevant to the data consumer, right? So let's narrow the scope. Here's just some examples of how you could approach, including and excluding different types of studies. And this would be part of your design process. So you go in, you really think about what is included versus what you're not going to include. And you might have, like this is an example where you might have a particular series that has scanned paperwork. You don't want to have that coming through and things like that. Some additional considerations, Florian, you can maybe chime in a little bit on this. So, for example, is the algorithm that's going to consume the data, does it require that the chronological information remain available to the research organization? So,
well, the answer to that is it depends, right? So, if you don't know what you're intending to do with the data set, then the answer to that question could be any answer, right? So, in the case of the projects that we did, it's absolutely incredibly important that the chronology of the creation of those exams still be identifiable by somebody looking at the data sets. So, and furthermore, you want to be able to tell, are these 5 image data sets belonging to one patient, and they're all relevant priors for one patient, or do they belong to 5 distinct patients? Because you've de-identified all the names and dates of birth and all of that. So again, the design of the de-identification process is where you need to decide, with us, before we start de-identifying, what is the intent for the data? How are they going to be used? And what is going to constitute usable data by the researchers?
Well put, well put. Other considerations, we touched a little bit about excluding secondary capture objects, for example, the scan paperwork, and indicating if there's a correlation for time lapse, etc., which we were just discussing. So the QA process, we did touch on this already. It's just very important to have that secondary check so that you made the best effort you can to protect an individual's private information. And that's that second tier we talked about. So the framework altogether, when you put all those pieces together, it's not just about, I should say, a HIPAA privacy rule being met. It's about providing the cleanest, most usable data. Those algorithms, I think Florent mentioned, require like 100,000 images to learn. So we want to make sure that we're providing the cleanest, most usable data. We're getting closer to the cure if we're doing that type of research. We're getting the best outcome from the algorithm that's going to work as a tool. So that's important. And then you want to filter, along the same lines, we filter the source so that we're efficiently processing. We're not throwing out or getting a bunch of output that no one's going to use. And of course, we normalize it so it's easy to query, easy to work with. For those of you who, I think Taylor reached out to several of you, but if you're in a nonprofit or a university or a researcher affiliated with a host institution like that, a government agency who's performing biomedical research, we have a de-identification tool. It's a really interesting DICOM tag editor. It's a manual tool. It's not necessarily a process, but it's great. And it's good to kind of get your feet wet, an idea about how de-identification can be done. So if you're an organization that qualifies, reach back out to Taylor and our marketing department later on. It is available for purchase as well if you're not one of those types of organizations. Okay, so time for a couple of questions here. I think we're getting close to the wire. Here's a question here. Okay.
We do have a few questions, Josh, and but there's one of them in particular that I'd like to answer up front. A gentleman by the name of Bob asked, how manual is this process of pixel level de-identification? In his concept of it, it seems to be a pretty manual and labor intensive process, and it could be, but it doesn't have to be. And so to answer your question, there's a couple of ways that you could be looking at it. Number one, how well known is the data set coming out of the modality, right? So if you know for a fact that a specific ultrasound device is always going to have PHI in a specific set of coordinates in the image, then the script that is being used for the transformation rule in the de-identification process can make sure that anything coming from that AE title, that IP address, that device is going to apply a mask or a blur or pixelation on the appropriate coordinates. The variability is where that becomes dangerous, and that's where we recommend excluding data sets that could introduce variability, because this is a pretty linear process. If you think about it, we're not involving artificial intelligence in the process of recognizing PHI quite yet. I don't think the industry is quite there yet. I think we may get there soon, especially with advances in OCR and ability to apply logic to natural language processing. But in the meantime, for us to make this a non-manual process, meaning an automated process as much as possible for you, Bob, we would need to understand how reliable is the data source to always have the PHI in the same coordinates. If it's unreliable, then exclude it from the data set, because you're going to almost certainly introduce some kind of a HIPAA violation. I hope that answers the question, Bob.
That's a good insight into that. And Bob, if that is a reliable location, then it's just a matter of spending some time going through a sampling of your data and confirming, validating that indeed it's always the same coordinates, and identifying the coordinates. And then we just put that into our script, the identification script algorithms, to go ahead and always mask those particular coordinates. So there's a little bit of homework up front. There's a little bit of making sure, as Florent mentioned, that it's reliably always going to be in the same spot, because you don't want it to be slightly offset or an obscure field that might, in some condition, be populated and burned in on the screen. Another question here, how long does it take to deploy de-identification? Well, as we've kind of revisited a few times, this is a very customized process. So it really is driven by the need of the consumer of the data. So the deployment times are going to vary based on a couple of variables. One is the complexity of the de-identification rules. Do we have multiple items to de-identify? For example, are we doing the DICOM headers? And are we also doing pixel anonymization? Are we approaching the DICOM header de-identification as blanking out most of them, or are we replacing them? So we have to come up with a hash, etc. Also, once we go through and create the initial framework, it has to be put into the hands of your staff, and then you go through and test it, evaluate the output. Is it what you're looking for? Typically, there's a little bit of tweaking along that way of the testing. So the availability of your team to be available to test it, provide quick input, response back to us, and so on, we'll move everything along pretty quick. So yeah, it's a very customized, very flexible process, just to keep that in mind.
So the next question I'd like to answer was about the QC process. How was QC implemented? Was it a specific type of sampling? The answer is no. It was 100% processing of all the images systematically, right? So it was a serial process where the first server de-identifies the images according to the script agreed upon with our customer. And then before the images leave the hospital, they have to go through QA, right? So serially, all the images that were de-identified were also QA'd sequentially right after that. And it was 100% sampling, not a smaller percentage. I hope that answers your question. And then we have a couple of other questions. Let me go through a couple of them here. What about third-party non-standard DICOM tags? Okay, so that's a very interesting question. So as you know, modality vendors and PACS vendors take a lot of liberty with the DICOM standard, and we routinely run into non-standard DICOM tags. And so if you were to apply a cookie cutter process to de-identification of those images, then you would probably miss those DICOM tags that could potentially contain PHI. And so before we begin a project like this, it's important that we understand the full cross-section of the images that are intended to be de-identified. And if we run into non-standard DICOM tags, we need to identify that before we start the de-identification process. And so Like I said, if you were trying to do this in a cookie cutter way, then we would miss those third-party non-standard DICOM tags. But there needs to be a discovery process that's very thorough up front, and we request samples of all the images before we get started on the project. And in some cases, if there is, again, too much variability from a specific vendor because they take too many liberties with DICOM, then that vendor should probably be excluded from the de-identification project. It's that simple, right? The risk of introducing a vulnerability outweighs the benefit of including that vendor in the study, even if it represents a substantial chunk of data that are needed for the research, or it needs to be addressed some other way. But non-standard DICOM tags need to be identified up front before we start. Hope that answers your question.
Those are good points.
And sorry, Josh, I think this is a super important question. One of our audience members asked about the defacing, of 3D images. So I personally am not aware of an actual HIPAA ruling on the topic, but there is a very interesting article that was written by a couple of researchers at the University of Tulsa in Oklahoma, and we'd be happy to, send you a link to that. But the article is called "Preserving Privacy in Structural Neuroimages." If you want to research that and find the abstract for yourself, it's a really interesting analysis of the problem, specifically addressing this. It's very possible. I'm not a complete HIPAA expert, so if there is a ruling on the topic, I'm not aware of it yet. It's possible there is one, but it's definitely worth looking into.
Great question. Great question. So we're getting at the end. We're going to wrap up now, but if you have additional questions, we're going to go ahead. The ones we can't get to, we'll go ahead and respond to you offline. Additionally, you can always shoot those across to us. Feel free to connect with us. You can reach us on LinkedIn or Twitter, and feel free to reach out. And also, you can visit us online. Our website has some really great tools you can download and use, and also give an idea of some of the workflow solutions we provide. I want to thank everyone for joining today, and good luck in your endeavors for de-identification.